Look, I'm not saying the Galactic Council's combat assessment program was a bad idea. I'm just saying that when you invite species from across the galaxy to demonstrate their natural combat capabilities without technological assistance, maybe, and this is just a suggestion, you should probably check what natural means to each species first. But hey, what do I know? I'm just the narrator of this particular clusterfuck. The Zephyrian Combat Academy's main arena was a sight to behold, assuming you enjoyed the aesthetic of maximum intimidation meets corporate conference room. Picture a coliseum designed by committee, where every terrifying architectural detail had been focus grouped to death, and then sanitized by the Galactic Health and Safety Commission. Standing in the center of this monument to bureaucratic violence was Corporal David Tank Kowalski, late of the Human Colonial Marines, currently of the Why Did I Volunteer for This Shit School of Regrettable Life Choices. At 6'2" and built like someone had asked a very talented sculptor to carve practical violence out of compressed muscle and bad attitude, Tank was the kind of human that made other humans feel slightly inadequate about their commitment to physical fitness. He was also, at this particular moment, wondering if his decision to represent humanity in the Council's Natural Combat Capabilities Assessment had been the stupidest thing he'd ever done. And considering his service record included that incident with the gravity well generator on Kepler 442b, that was saying something. "Attention, beings," announced the arena's sound system in the artificially cheerful voice that all bureaucratic announcements seem to share across the galaxy. Today's assessment will determine each species' natural combat effectiveness without technological augmentation. Please remember that this is a scientific evaluation, and all participants are expected to maintain appropriate levels of Yeah, we get it," Tank muttered, rolling his shoulders. "Don't kill each other too much. Got it." The Galactic Council, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that after centuries of technological warfare, they needed to understand each member species' baseline combat capabilities. Just in case. The kind of just in case that definitely wasn't related to the recent uptick in border skirmishes with the hegemony. Definitely not. Spoiler alert, it absolutely was. Tank looked around the arena at his fellow volunteers, and he used that term with all the air quotes his mental voice could muster. The selection was, to put it diplomatically, diverse. And to put it honestly, looked like someone had raided the galaxy's most dangerous zoo. To his left stood Krextha the Destroyer, a Thrakari warrior whose species looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a bad attitude, and then given the result anger management issues. Thrakari were known throughout the galaxy for two things: their ability to charge through solid walls, and their complete inability to understand the concept of indoor voice. Krextha stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in natural armor plating that had probably laughed off more weapons fire than Tank's old unit had ever seen. To his right was Whisper, because of course that was the only name anyone could pronounce, a Shadowkin operative whose species had evolved on a world where being visible was apparently considered a character flaw. Shadowkin could bend light around themselves, move with absolute silence, and had reflexes that made hummingbirds look sluggish. Whisper looked like smoke given form and murderous intent, which was probably accurate. Across the arena lounged, and there really wasn't another word for it, Gornax, a Stellari heavy combatant whose species had decided that the best evolutionary strategy was to become living siege weapons. Gornax stood 10 feet tall, had skin that could probably stop small meteors, and arms that looked like they could bench press a small space station. The Stellari were known for their straightforward approach to problem solving, which generally involved hitting things until they stopped being problems. Now you might be wondering why a human was standing in an arena with what amounted to the galaxy's nastiest collection of natural-born killers. Fair question. The answer, as usual, came down to paperwork and the kind of bureaucratic mix-up that would make Kafka weep. The thing about humans joining the Galactic Council was that everyone had sort of assumed they knew what they were getting. Earth's application had listed humans as bipedal, tool-using, persistence hunters with notable adaptability. Which sounded, civilized. Boring even. What the application hadn't mentioned, mostly because humans had thought it was so obvious it didn't need saying, was that Earth was basically a death world where everything evolved to kill everything else. And humans had climbed to the top of that particular food chain through a combination of stupid bravery, pack tactics, and an absolutely unhinged willingness to make any object into a weapon. The Galactic Council had read tool using and thought peaceful technicians. They hadn't considered that humans had been perfecting the art of violence with improvised weapons since before they'd figured out agriculture. This was about to become very, very apparent. "Combatants," announced the arena's AI, "please prepare for assessment. First round, unarmed combat against automated training constructs." Tank cracked his knuckles. a sound that seemed to make Whisper flinch, which was interesting, and watched as the arena floor opened to reveal rising platforms. On each platform stood what the Council optimistically called training constructs, but what Tank immediately recognized as robots specifically designed to beat the shit out of you. Each construct was roughly humanoid, covered in impact-resistant padding, and armed with non-lethal shock weapons that would definitely hurt, but probably wouldn't cause permanent damage. The keyword being probably. Constructs are programmed to standard combat protocols, the AI continued. Participants will be evaluated on technique, efficiency, and combat effectiveness. Begin when ready. Krextha immediately charged his construct with all the subtlety of an avalanche, letting out a war cry that probably registered on nearby seismographs. His approach to combat was refreshingly direct. Run at the enemy, hit it with your face, repeat as necessary. The construct tried to sidestep, but 8 feet of armored rhino person had its own ideas about physics. The sound of the impact was like a cargo shuttle crashing into a mountain. 1 point to the Thrakari for making physics weep. Gornax took a more measured approach, which for a Stellari meant he walked toward his construct at a pace that suggested geological processes were rushing him. When the construct tried to shock him with its weapon, Gornax simply grabbed the robot by its head and squeezed. The sickening crunch that followed suggested the construct's warranty had just been voided. 2 points to the Stellari for simplicity. Whisper, meanwhile, had simply vanished. One moment she was there. The next moment her construct was falling apart into precisely cut pieces while making confused electronic noises. Tank hadn't even seen her move. 3 points to the Shadowkin for making the laws of physics file a complaint. Then it was Tank's turn. Now here's the thing about human combat training. While other species had evolved natural weapons, claws, armor, venom, the ability to phase through solid matter, humans had evolved something much more dangerous: creativity, and pattern recognition, and the absolute refusal to fight fair when their lives were on the line. Tank looked at his construct, which was already moving toward him with the jerky, determined gait that marked it as a learning AI. It was analyzing his stance, his movements, probably running through a database of human combat techniques that some well-meaning programmer had uploaded from Earth's martial arts archives. Which was adorable, really. What the programmer had apparently missed was that every human combat technique shared one fundamental principle: use whatever works, and when that stops working, use something else. Preferably something unexpected. Preferably something that would make your opponent question their life choices. The construct reached striking distance, and launched a perfectly executed punch toward Tank's center mass. Tank sidestepped, grabbed the robot's extended arm, and did something that made every alien in the observation deck lean forward with interest. He yanked. Not just pulled. Yanked with the kind of full-body torque that comes from a lifetime of Earth gravity, and the casual understanding that everything in the universe can be broken if you hit it from the right angle. The construct, designed to handle impacts and strikes, had apparently not been programmed for human decides to violate local zoning laws regarding leverage and physics. The robot's arm came off. Not damaged, not disabled. Off! As in, no longer attached to the rest of the robot. Well, Tank said conversationally, hefting the severed limb like a club. This is awkward. The construct, to its credit, attempted to adapt to this new situation by trying to grab Tank with its remaining arm. Tank introduced it to its own limb with enough force to dent the arena floor. Impact 1. Construct 0. Galactic Council's faith in their robot design, experiencing rapid unscheduled disassembly. The whole thing had taken maybe 5 seconds. In the observation deck, approximately 50 representatives from various galactic species were having what could generously be called a moment. The kind of moment that comes when you realize you may have significantly misunderstood something important. Did the human just... started Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony. Disarm an armed opponent by literally disarming it? Finished Councillor Jexny. Yes, he did. Is that normal for humans? Down in the arena, Tank was examining the construct's severed arm with professional interest. Hey, he called up to the observation deck. Who designed these things? Because whoever it was has never had to deal with someone who grew up fixing farm equipment. See, here's what the Galactic Council was slowly beginning to understand. Humans didn't just use tools. They saw everything as a potential tool. A rock could be a hammer. A stick could be a spear. A robot's arm could be a very sophisticated club. This was not, as it turned out, a philosophical position. This was a survival strategy. Impressive, came a voice from behind Tank. He turned to see that Whisper had somehow appeared next to him without making a sound. Your species approaches combat creatively. Thanks, Tank said, still holding the robot arm. Though I'm pretty sure I just voided someone's warranty. The construct will be rebuilt, Gornax rumbled from across the arena. Your technique was efficient. Krextha, who had reduced his construct to a pile of sparking debris, nodded approvingly. Humans fight with honor, even if they fight strangely. Now, at this point, you might think the assessment was over. After all, 4 species, 4 successful demonstrations of natural combat ability. Everyone goes home, files their reports, and the bureaucrats get to feel good about their data collection. You would be wrong. Attention combatants, announced the AI, with what Tank was beginning to suspect was malicious cheerfulness. Round 2 will now commence. Participants will engage in direct combat against each other to establish relative capability rankings. Oh no. Tank looked around the arena at his fellow assessees. Krextha, who looked like he could headbutt his way through a space station's hull. Gornax, who could probably arm wrestle a gravitational field. Whisper, who might already be standing behind him for all he knew. This was about to get interesting. Rules are simple, the AI continued. No lethal force. No permanent damage. Combat continues until one participant yields or is rendered unable to continue. Participants may choose their opponents. And here's where things got complicated. The thing about galactic politics, and Tank was rapidly becoming an expert, despite having never wanted to be one, was that everything was about perception. The Thrakari were known for their straightforward aggression, the Stellari for their inexorable strength, the Shadowkin for their precision and stealth. Humans? Well, humans were the new guys, the unknowns. The species that had shown up with primitive technology and a concerning enthusiasm for turning any situation into a learning experience. And right now, 3 apex predators were looking at Tank like he was either the weakest link or the most dangerous unknown in the room. I will face the human, Krextha announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved by running at it very fast. Let us see what these persistence hunters can truly do. Oh, buddy, you really shouldn't have said that. Tank sighed, set down the robot arm, though he noted its location for future reference, and turned to face the Thrakari warrior. Look, are you sure about this? Because I feel like I should mention that humans have a really bad track record with fair fights. Explain, Krextha demanded, beginning what Tank was recognizing as the Thrakari pre-charge ritual. It involved a lot of hoof stamping and what sounded like cursing in several languages. Well, Tank said, stretching his arms, the thing about humans is that we spent most of our evolutionary history figuring out how to kill things that were bigger, stronger, faster, and better armed than we were. So we got really, really good at cheating. And there it was. The thing that the Galactic Council hadn't quite grasped about humanity's application to join their little club. When the form had said persistence hunters, they'd been thinking about humans chasing down prey over long distances. They hadn't been thinking about the fact that humans had spent millennia learning how to kill everything else on their planet, including things that could kill them back. There is no dishonor in using superior strength and natural weapons, Krextha declared, lowering his armored head. I am ready. That's the thing, though, Tank said, rolling his shoulders. Humans don't really do natural weapons. We do whatever works. The arena's starting signal sounded, a gentle chime that seemed absurdly polite given what was about to happen. Krextha charged. Now, a Thrakari charge is something to behold. 8 feet of natural armor and concentrated aggression moving at roughly 30 miles per hour with the kind of kinetic energy that could punch through light vehicle armor. Krextha had probably ended fights with this exact technique hundreds of times. Tank sidestepped. Not dramatically, not with flourish. Just moved, like someone avoiding a puddle on the sidewalk. Krextha, committed to his charge and suddenly finding nothing in front of him except empty space, had just enough time to think, oh shit, in whatever language Thrakari used for existential regret before Tank's boot introduced itself to the back of the warrior's knee, with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive experience in finding the weak points in heavy armor. The Thrakari went down like a felled tree, skidding across the arena floor with the graceless momentum of someone whose charge had just been converted into an uncontrolled slide by basic physics and human spite. Time elapsed, approximately 2 seconds. Thrakari confidence, experiencing catastrophic structural failure. See, Tank said, almost apologetically, as Krextha struggled to regain his footing. The thing about natural armor is that it's really great at protecting your front. But joints are joints, no matter what species you are. Krextha rolled to his feet, credit where it was due, Thrakari were tough, and turned to face Tank with what might have been respect mixing with his obvious frustration. You fight like a coward, he growled, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely displeased about this. I fight like someone who wants to go home, Tank corrected. Big difference. Round 2 was about to begin. This time, Krathos approached more cautiously, apparently having learned that charging blindly at humans was roughly equivalent to volunteering for physics lessons taught by someone with anger management issues. He circled Tank, looking for an opening, his armor plates shifting with each step. Tank, meanwhile, was doing something that was making the observation deck very nervous. He was studying his opponent with the kind of clinical attention that usually preceded either a breakthrough scientific discovery or a war crime. "You know," Tank said conversationally as they circled each other, "Thrakari anatomy is fascinating. All that natural armor, the redundant muscle groups, the reinforced skeletal structure. Really impressive evolutionary adaptations. Your point, human?" "Well," Tank said and then moved. "Here's what happened next, because it occurred too fast for most of the observers to follow." Tank didn't attack Krathos' armor. He didn't try to match strength with strength or armor with armor. Instead, he did what humans had been doing for millennia when faced with bigger, stronger opponents. He cheated. Specifically, he grabbed Krathos' arm, used the Thrakari's own forward momentum against him, and introduced him to the arena floor with a hip throw that would have made his old martial arts instructor weep with pride. Time elapsed, 1.5 seconds. Thrakari dignity, filed under missing in action. Krathos hit the ground hard enough to rattle the arena's structural supports, his armor plates clacking against the floor like a broken percussion section. For a moment, Tank thought he might have overdone it. Thrakari were tough, but physics was physics, and physics didn't care about your evolutionary advantages. Then Krathos started laughing, not chuckling, not chortling. Full-throated, head back, probably audible from orbit laughing. "By the 7 moons of Thrakos," the warrior gasped, struggling to sit up. "The human fights like a Thrakari grandmother." Tank blinked. "Is that good?" "Thrakari grandmothers are terrifying," Krathos explained, finally managing to get to his feet. "They fight without honor, use every dirty trick in the ancestral memory, and always win." He clasped Tank on the shoulder with enough force to rearrange his skeletal structure. "I yield. This has been educational." And there it was. The moment when the galaxy's toughest warrior species discovered that humans didn't fight fair and decided this was actually pretty cool. From across the arena, Whisper's voice drifted like smoke. "I would like to test myself against the human next." Tank looked over at the Shadowkin operative, who had somehow managed to appear even more ominous while standing perfectly still. "You sure?" "Because I should probably mention that humans are really paranoid about things they can't see." "Explain." "Well," Tank said, stretching again, "when you spend most of your evolutionary history getting eaten by things that hunt in the dark, you develop some interesting reflexes." What Tank didn't mention, because he was pretty sure it would start a diplomatic incident, was that human paranoia about invisible threats had led to some very specific training protocols in the colonial marines. Protocols that had names like urban combat against stealth units and sensor-denied environment operations. The Shadowkin were about to discover that humans had been preparing for invisible opponents for centuries. "I am ready when you are," Whisper said and promptly vanished. Tank closed his eyes. Now, this might seem like a bad tactical decision when facing an invisible opponent who could probably fillet you before you knew they were there. But Tank had learned something during his tour with the Marines. When you can't trust your eyes, you trust everything else. Sound, air movement, the tiny changes in temperature that came with another living being moving through space. The almost subliminal vibrations that traveled through the ground with each footstep. Humans might not have natural armor or built-in weapons or the ability to bend light, but they had something else. 100,000 generations of ancestors who had survived by being absolutely, pathologically aware of everything in their environment that might want to kill them. Tank heard it first, the whisper-soft sound of fabric moving through air. Then he felt it, the tiny shift in air pressure that came with something large moving fast toward his back. He spun, grabbed, and came up with a handful of what felt like smoke given form and very definite opinions about being grabbed. Time elapsed, 0.7 seconds. Shadowkin's stealth advantage, experiencing technical difficulties. "Gotcha," Tank said pleasantly, maintaining his grip on what he hoped was Whisper's arm. "You know, you guys are really quiet, but you still have to breathe." Whisper materialized in his grip, looking like smoke condensing into the shape of someone who was rapidly reevaluating several life choices. "How?" "Practice," Tank said. "Lots and lots of very unpleasant practice." He loosened his grip slightly. "Want to call it here, or should we see what happens when an unstoppable force meets someone who's really tired of dealing with physics today?" For a moment, They stayed frozen like that. Tank holding onto a Shadowkin operative who could probably have killed him 6 different ways in the time it took his heart to beat once, both of them apparently thinking very hard about their next moves. Then Whisper did something unexpected. She laughed. It was a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane, barely audible but somehow conveying genuine amusement. "You fight like prey that refuses to be prey," she said. "This is refreshing." "Thanks," Tank said, still not entirely sure whether he was about to be congratulated or murdered. "So we good here?" "We are good," Whisper agreed, and stepped back as Tank released her arm. "I yield. Your reflexes are adequate." Coming from a Shadowkin, adequate was apparently high praise, which left Gornax. Tank looked across the arena at the 10-foot-tall siege weapon masquerading as a person, and felt something that might charitably be called concern. The Stellari heavy combatant was watching him with the kind of professional interest that usually preceded either a job offer or a funeral. "So," Tank called out, "I'm guessing you want a turn?" Gornax nodded slowly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey the inevitability of continental drift. It would be educational, and there was that word again. Educational. In Tank's experience, when aliens started using that word, someone was about to learn something they really didn't want to know. "Right," Tank said, rolling his shoulders. "Fair warning. Humans have a really complicated relationship with things that are bigger than us." "How complicated?" Gornax asked, beginning his approach. Unlike Krathos' charge or Whisper's stealth, the Stellari's movement was more like watching geology in motion. Slow, inevitable, and probably capable of reshaping local geography. "Well," Tank said, backpedaling to maintain distance. "On the one hand, we're generally smart enough to avoid picking fights with things that could use us as toothpicks. On the other hand, we spent most of our evolutionary history killing things that could use us as toothpicks." "Ah," Gornax said, still advancing with the relentless patience of erosion. "And which instinct is stronger?" Tank considered this as he continued backing away from what amounted to a walking earthquake. "Honestly, depends on the day. And how much sleep I've had." What Tank didn't mention was that humans had developed some very specific strategies for dealing with opponents who were bigger, stronger, and better armored than they were. These strategies generally fell into 3 categories: run away, use tools, and find the weak spot. Since running away wasn't really an option in an arena, and tools were technically forbidden, that left option 3, which was going to be interesting. Gornax reached striking distance and threw a punch that displaced enough air to register as a weather event. Tank ducked under it, barely, and immediately discovered that the Stellari had anticipated this exact response. Gornax's other hand was already coming down in a hammer blow that would have converted Tank into something roughly the consistency of jam. Tank dove sideways, rolled, and came up with his back against the arena wall and a 10-foot-tall alien siege engine bearing down on him with the inevitability of a tax audit. This was not, he reflected, his best day. But here's the thing about humans in desperate situations. They bring out either the worst in people or the absolute best. And Tank had spent enough time in desperate situations to know which category he usually fell into. Instead of trying to dodge again, because Gornax was clearly anticipating that, Tank did something that made everyone in the observation deck sit up and take notice. He charged. Not at Gornax's center mass, because that would have been suicide with extra steps. Not at his head, because that was roughly 10 feet off the ground and covered in natural armor that could probably stop orbital bombardment. At his knees, because joints, as Tank had recently demonstrated with Krathos, were universal weak points. And leverage, as any human who had ever used a crowbar could tell you, was the closest thing to magic that physics allowed. Tank hit Gornax's leading leg at ankle height with a diving tackle that converted every ounce of his momentum into a very specific application of force, designed to introduce a 10-foot-tall Stellari to the concept of center of gravity. Time elapsed. 1.2 seconds. Stellari assumptions about bipedal locomotion, under review. Gornax went down like a controlled demolition, hitting the arena floor with enough force to register on seismic monitors in the next star system. For a moment, Tank wasn't sure if he'd just won a fight or started a geological event. Then Gornax started laughing, a sound like landslides having a conversation. "Remarkable," the Stellari rumbled, making no immediate effort to get up. "You fight like a Stellari child." Tank, who was beginning to detect a pattern in these comparisons, groaned as he pulled himself to his feet. "Let me guess. Stellari children are terrifying?" "Stellari children have not yet learned that some problems cannot be solved by simply hitting them harder," Gornax explained, finally beginning the process of returning to vertical. "They are creative in their applications of force. Is that good or bad?" It is effective, Gornak said, which seemed to be the highest praise the Stellari vocabulary allowed. I yield, this has been educational. And there was that word again. Tank looked around the arena at his 3 former opponents. Krextha, still chuckling about Thrakari grandmothers. Whisper, who had somehow managed to appear even more shadowy while looking grudgingly impressed. And Gornax, who was dusting himself off with the careful dignity of someone who had just learned that physics applied to everyone, regardless of size. In the observation deck, 50 representatives from various galactic species were having what could generously be called a collective moment of realization. So, came the voice of the arena's AI, with what Tank was now certain was barely suppressed electronic panic. The assessment appears to be complete. Preliminary results indicate that human combat effectiveness is significant. Translation: oh shit, we may have seriously miscalculated. But the real moment of truth came when Ambassador Veltar of the Hegemony, the species that had been making increasingly aggressive moves toward Council space, leaned forward in the observation deck and said, very carefully, "Perhaps we should discuss the parameters for future assessments." Translation: maybe starting fights with humans isn't the brilliant strategic move we thought it was. Tank, meanwhile, was having his own moment of realization, not about combat or strategy or galactic politics, but about something much simpler. He was really tired. "Hey," he called up to the observation deck. "Are we done here? Because I've got a transport to catch, and I'd really like to grab a shower before I have to explain to my commanding officer why I just introduced 3 of the galaxy's toughest species to the concept of human stubbornness." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how Corporal David Tank Kowalski accidentally redefined humanity's reputation in the galaxy. Not through superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but by demonstrating that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to win fights they had no business surviving, let alone winning. It was also how the Galactic Council learned that when you ask a species to demonstrate their natural combat capabilities, you should probably be more specific about what natural means to a species that considers improvisation a survival trait. Because humans, as it turned out, viewed using everything in the environment as a weapon as perfectly natural behavior. Go figure. Epilogue. 3 months later, Tank was sitting in a bar on Kepler Station, nursing a beer that had been brewed by someone who clearly understood that humans needed their alcohol to taste like it had opinions about life, when Krextha walked in. The Thrakari warrior looked around the bar with the kind of professional interest that suggested he was either planning to start a fight or prevent one, spotted Tank, and made his way over with the subtle grace of a controlled avalanche. "Human," Krextha said, settling into a chair that immediately began questioning its structural integrity. "Thrakari," Tank replied. "Fancy meeting you here." "I have been thinking about our encounter in the arena," Krextha said, gesturing to the bartender for what Tank hoped was a beverage and not a weapon. "About the way you fight." "Yeah? And what's the verdict?" Krextha's drink arrived, something that glowed faintly and probably violated several health codes, and he took a sip before answering. "I have been teaching your techniques to my war brothers." Tank nearly choked on his beer. "Come again?" "The concept of using an opponent's strength against them. Of targeting joints and pressure points rather than attempting to overcome superior armor through brute force. Of thinking tactically rather than simply charging." Krextha took another sip of his probably radioactive drink. "These are valuable lessons." "And how's that working out for you?" Krextha's expression, at least what Tank could see of it behind the natural armor plating, might have been what passed for a grin among his species. "The Hegemony invaded our border worlds last week." Tank set down his beer. "Oh shit, are you okay? Do you need—" "They retreated after 12 hours, Krextha continued, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone sharing particularly good gossip. "Apparently they were not prepared for Thrakari who fought like humans." And there it was, the moment when Tank realized that his little demonstration in the Combat Academy had done more than just prevent a diplomatic incident. It had started something. "They're calling it the human combat philosophy in military circles," Krextha added, apparently enjoying Tank's expression of growing concern. "The concept that any environment can provide weapons, any opponent has exploitable weaknesses, and that the best way to win a fight is to make sure your enemy never realizes they were in one until it's over." "Oh no," Tank said. "Oh yes," Krextha agreed cheerfully. "Whisper has been teaching Shadowkin operatives human tracking techniques, how to hunt invisible opponents by using senses other than sight. Gornax has been showing Stellari engineers how to apply leverage principles to their construction projects. The results have been educational." There was that word again. "And the council?" Tank asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to know. Has officially classified humans as a Tier 1 combat species, and issued guidelines recommending that all member worlds treat human requests with what they call appropriate consideration. Krextha finished his glowing drink and stood up, which I believe translates to maybe don't piss them off. Tank stared at his beer, watching the bubbles rise to the surface while he processed this information. So what you're telling me is that I accidentally turned humanity into the galaxy's bogeymen. Not bogeymen, Krextha corrected. Teachers, there is a difference. Is there? Bogeymen inspire fear, the Thurkari warrior said, heading for the door. Teachers inspire respect, and occasionally existential dread when their students surpass their expectations. As Krextha left, Tank found himself alone with his thoughts and the slowly dawning realization that his little demonstration had somehow kicked off a galactic revolution in military thinking. Somewhere out there, species that had been fighting the same way for millennia were learning that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history figuring out how to win fights they shouldn't have been able to win, and they were getting very, very good at it. Tank finished his beer, left enough credits on the table to cover the drink, and a generous tip for the bartender who had served alcohol to a Thurkari without asking questions, and headed for his transport. He had reports to file, superiors to brief, and the uncomfortable knowledge that humanity had just accidentally become the galaxy's most sought-after military consultants. All because someone had asked if humans could fight without guns. The answer, as it turned out, was, yes, but you're not going to like how. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Final assessment. When you invite a species that evolved on a death world to demonstrate their natural combat capabilities, maybe don't be surprised when they demonstrate that they consider everything in the universe to be a potential weapon, every opponent to have exploitable weaknesses, and every fight to be a problem-solving exercise. The Galactic Council learned this lesson the hard way. The hegemony learned it considerably harder. And somewhere in the galaxy, a human marine was probably explaining to his commanding officer why interstellar incidents kept following him around like stray cats. Some things, it seemed, never changed. The end.